which leads us to the number one biggest mistake people make when they do management training. And that mistake is assuming everybody in the organization needs to be a leader. And right now, some of you say, I don't like that bald guy because he's saying that we don't need leaders. No, I'm not saying you don't need leaders. You just don't need a whole bunch of them, right? What's going to happen if everybody's a leader? Who's going to do the following? If everybody's out casting vision, who's going to make sure the trains run on time? It's a bad pun with the train outside the window there, isn't it? But if we do it correctly, the top will rise, and those are the ones that you want to do leadership development with. And at the end, I'm going to show you how to do that. So let's not make the assumption that this is the right way to approach it. We want to have a plan in place so that we get the right people in the job and ultimately the right people from that select group that can be our organization's leaders. And you too, you're stressed out. Nothing's going well, lots of dark gray clouds. Let's think about what opportunities there are. And so I see 3 opportunities for us during this time. And by the way, if you are a firefighter, police officer, any first responder, doctor, nurse, technician, if you're a grocery clerk or a truck driver, you have your hands full, and we are grateful for you. For the rest of us that aren't working right now, let's make the most of that time. So here's 3 suggestions. Number 1, read. Let's just visualize this taking an hour out of our day, because I'm telling you what, I got a lot of time now, right? That's the gift that we all have. I got time, you got time. What if we took an hour a day to read on a particular subject? If a year goes by and we've been quarantined for that long, man, that's going to be awful. But just think what you might gain if you've read for an hour a day on a particular subject. Think of the expertise. What about learn? Maybe there's a new skill that you've been wanting to master for a long time. In terms of a business skill, this is one of mine here, using this technique called the Cablo. It's a drawing technique. And it has completely changed the way that I want to teach courses, but I learned that. And then the third component down here is practice. For those of you that played a musical instrument when you were little, you hated practice, remember? And you had your own clock, you're like, please let this 30 minutes be over. But what if we were to read and learn? What if we were to learn and intake? And then finally, what if we were to practice? Think about this, 1, 2, 3 hours a day. We do that for let's pretend maybe in 2 months this is over with. How about 4 months? How about 6 months? What if it indeed is a year? Visualize what you will be in terms of skill and value if it is March the 27th, 2021. You'll be a genius by then. So folks, I don't have a lot of good news to share, and don't turn the news on, you won't see it there either. But what if we make the most of this time? This time is a gift. So the other day I was talking to my mom, all right? Now my mom normally will talk to me maybe every week or so. We'll just talk for a little while. And one of the things she always tells me is, I love my job, I love my job. I'm so grateful that I have my job. So she is an admin assistant, receptionist at a publishing company in Maryland. So of course now with COVID-19, her boss made her go home with full pay, of course, which is great. My mom's 84 years old. So this is good for her, and I'm really happy that she's being taken care of. But she is going absolutely crazy. And before we might talk for a few minutes, now she'll talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. Well, you know, also last week I did a workshop for one of our customers, and it was about remote work. And so I did a survey. I sent it out asking people for what their biggest challenges were. And I have seen quite often the biggest challenge is the isolation. Now, I can't relate to that because frankly, I have a small team. My team lives in Maryland, I live in Tennessee. I spend about 30 weeks on the road alone. I live on 32 acres away from any neighbors, and I kind of like my peace and quiet. So for me, this is no big deal. And it made me think about a tool that we use in our workshops. The tool is called the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. And one of those dichotomies, which is all about energy, is the difference between a person with a preference for introversion and extroversion. And I believe this is the reason why 60% of remote workers are struggling today. So I'm guessing when most people say Myers-Briggs, they always think about introvert, extrovert. So the first thing you have to do is you got to use the right words. You don't say I'm an introvert. You say I have a preference for introversion. Okay, so that's the first mark of an amateur. You have a preference. When we say preference, this is just what you prefer. So for me, I am right-handed. My preferred hand to write with is right, but I also have access to the left. I'm not as good with it, but I can use it. Well, that's the way we are in terms of what we do and how we do things, and if we did a whole Myers-Briggs course, this would make more sense. But I do want to talk about the preferences for extroversion and introversion. All right, first of all, this is all about energy. It has nothing to do with being shy, with being outgoing, outspoken. It all has to do with energy. So what things get you pumped up and what things wear you down? Well, why don't we start with people that have a preference for extroversion. Now for them, what gets them pumped up is people. They like to be around people. People energize them. So maybe we look at activities, you could be in the office and you have a neighbor who has a preference for extroversion. Often they'll come to your office just to talk about ideas. And that's what's interesting about people that have this preference. They tend to speak to think, which means you're thinking here, but it's coming out right here. Which is why if you've ever been told, man, you sure are a loose cannon, you just sort of say whatever's on your mind, there's a slight chance that this could be the issue right here. And it's really funny because even my mom with her texts, they're big, great big long ones. You know, she just kind of goes on and on and on with them. So that is a person with a preference for extroversion. Now, the opposite, which is over here, which is where I kind of live, is a preference for introversion. Now, if you have this preference, quiet and reflection is probably what energizes you. The thought of going to a party already makes you tired thinking about it. And if you go to the party, you can be sociable, but it's exhausting. So like for me, with a preference for introversion, when I'm up doing an all-day workshop, at the end of the day, I'm exhausted. It's not that I don't like people. I just get tired when I'm around people and activities. When you understand this, then you can begin to work on it. And so, for example, if you have a preference for introversion and you're in an office environment, it might be good to take frequent breaks away from people. If you happen to be a person with a preference for extroversion, it might be a good idea to take some breaks with people. And that's really cool. So why did I say 60% of the remote workforce might be struggling? Well, population breakdowns, US and Canada, roughly 60% of the population identifies as preference for extroversion, 40% preference for introversion. Which means right now, when your workforce is remote, those on this side here probably enjoy it. Because for them, they can work, they have to get on Zoom calls, whatever, but then they can work. But I'm telling you what, people like this are going nuts right now. They crave the human interaction. So I'm going to recommend, if you're the boss or you're an HR professional and you're watching this today, get to know your people. For some, they need to have the regular dialogue. And if that's true, then I want you to engage with them. I want you to ask for their opinion. I want you to let them run ideas past you. This is what gets them going. And for people over here, give them a task, give them input if they need it, and leave them alone. When this is all over with, and many, not me because I work virtual, but many of you go back to work, you will have learned something very valuable about your team. And those lessons can be used even when you go back to work. But the question now is it possible to care too much? And I want to suggest the answer to that is absolutely yes. And so what I've done is I went ahead and I drew up a chart for you, and we've got 4 quadrants. Now each of these quadrants represents a different condition, and I'm going to describe what each one is. But we already know, let me find my red marker here, we already know that empathy is important. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look on the y-axis of our graph, and up here we are going to actually write the word empathy. Empathy. Okay, now on the other end of our spectrum here, we're going to do the opposite, which is sympathy. Sympathy. right? So as a quick definition, empathy is my ability, spell that right, empathy. There you go, empathy, got the H in there. So empathy is our ability to see a situation through the eyes of another, to look at an experience through the eyes of another that we can't firsthand relate to. Sympathy, which is down here, means that we're looking at a situation through our own eyes, our own lens, our own experience. Now, it doesn't mean that one's right and one is wrong. It just means that they're very different. And that difference is going to be profound as we start thinking about how we care about our employees. Now, on the x-axis, which goes from left to right or right to left, we're going to be talking about how we make our decisions. So on this end of our spectrum over here, we're using emotion. Write it in here, emotion. And over here, we are being rational. Rational. So when we're making a decision emotionally, we're thinking with our heart. We're deciding with our heart. With rational, we're deciding with our brain. Now, the question is, which one's right or wrong? There is no right or wrong, they're just different. So that leaves us with 4 quadrants. And only one of these quadrants is going to be the right approach for us to be taking. So why don't we start with probably the most common mistake that people make. I guess it was probably about, last year. It was in 2020. And I was working with a company. I work with the managers at this particular organization. It's a healthcare organization. And so every month I'll have one-on-one sessions. And so I was doing my one-on-ones. I think it was probably March or April. And one of the managers told me, she says, I feel like I'm burning out. I feel like that I just can't seem to keep on top of things. And I took a mental health day and I'm still stressed out and worn out. And I just don't know how to handle it. So we talked a little bit about it. And I asked her what was going on. And she says, well, for one, they are in the middle of a pandemic, so there's a lot of patient flow going in there. They are shorthanded right now. They're trying to hire new people, but it's hard to do it. And she says, not to mention, on top of all that, the contract to clean that particular part of the clinic has been, for whatever reason, it stopped, and they're waiting to get a new one in there. So she says, we're slammed with patients all day. Nobody really gets time for a lunch break. And at the end of the day, we got to stay and clean for 2 hours, right? So she says, I've been taking lunch for everybody. So if people want to go to lunch, I watch the patients. So I don't ever get a lunch break. And she says, at the end of the day, I volunteer to stay behind and clean the whole building by myself. It takes me about 2 hours. And she says, I'm just burned out. I said, well, let's think about it a minute here. Has your team ever specifically asked you to take lunch for them so they could go to lunch? She says, no, but I just feel like I know them and that's what they need. And I said, well, would the staff get paid overtime if they stayed to clean the clinic? She says, well, of course they would. And I said, well, have they ever said, hey, can we stay and clean the clinic? She says, yeah, but she says, I just know that they need a break, so I always do it for them. The challenge here, folks, is that in this case, the manager is being empathetic. She is attempting to look at the situation through the eyes of another, which we said was a good thing. The challenge is that she is making an emotional decision. And so that's what this looks like right here. See, here's the manager with this big rock. And what that rock is all of the baggage and burdens and stress of everybody else that the manager happens to be taking on for herself. And this is actually a pretty bad place to be. Right, let's get a different color here. We're gonna call this being dysfunctionally attached. Being dysfunctionally attached, which means what you're doing is you are doing everything and nobody else is doing anything. Ultimately, you will be the one that burns out. So this is the mistake a lot of people are making, especially now when times are tough, is they're taking everything. And what's happening now is they're probably not being respected. That respect is going away. This is actually the most dangerous, but these other ones lead to it. So we've got to talk about them too.
And our current reality is that for most of us, we are working from home. We might not be traveling. I know personally we don't travel anymore, so every day you get up, and every day to me seems like either a Saturday or a Monday. And I'm guessing that's about how you're feeling too. And what's really, really interesting when you think back on what life was before all of this happened is that we would go about normal routines. For example, you get up in the morning and you go to work. And if you weren't feeling it that day, you really didn't like your job, you didn't like your boss, what would you do? You would put on a mask and you would fake it. Or think about this, Sunday morning, those of you that go to church. Nothing makes a couple fight more than a drive to church. I remember this when I was a kid. And so what happens when you roll up in the parking lot after this big argument in the car? You get out, you put on your face, and suddenly you're, hello, I'm whatever. God bless you. Everybody's got a mask. Or maybe you got a gift. Maybe it was a very special Mother's Day gift. And you're like, God, that thing is nasty. But what do? You smile. See, for the most part, when things are good, we adapt to things that are not good by putting on a mask. But now that we're in the middle of something that's very different than any of us have ever experienced, sometimes what I'm starting to see, and I can only say it personally, I don't bother putting the mask on. If I don't like something, I just flat out tell somebody. So when we think about masks, we have to also think about what happens when life goes back to whatever the new normal is going to be. It's not always good to have this one on because you're not always able to share what's going on inside. And yet, I don't think anybody wants to be around this one. So the question is, who are you really? And have you taken the time to kind of think about who's underneath the mask? Because when all this is over, what people are going to remember is how you treated them when times were bad. So.